There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another Friday Reads. I don't have much chatty personal news, and that might be a relief for quite a few of you, because I do tend to go on when I do. Instead, I wanted to bring a couple things to your attention. BookTube stuff that's going on. The first is Bob the Bookerer is having another readathon. He just needs to learn the difference between a read-along and a readathon, but he is doing a readathon, whatever he might call it. It's called Indiecember, which is ingenious. I love the name. And he is encouraging us to read small press books and independent publisher books. And I have a SWAC. I have already filmed my TBR video, but I think I was even more disorganized than usual. So I think I'm going to redo it. Maybe with a martini in hand later tonight. Let's see how that goes, shall we? But I'm really stoked about that because that dovetails so well with kind of what I was planning to read in December. So yay! And also Kim of Middle of the Bookmark is launching a book club in January, which is, what is she calling it? The Blind Eye Book Club. And basically she is such a social animal that she wants to read the unread books on her shelf, but she doesn't want to do it by herself, so she's inviting all of us to read them along with her. And I'm in for the first book, definitely, because it's a book that I hadn't read, and I didn't own it, but I had another one by the same author, and everybody said it wasn't nearly as good as this one, the one that I didn't have, and that's the one she's doing. And I thought, well, I'll just leave it up to fate. And later that same day, I was out thrift shopping with my dear friend Gwen, and there was a brand new, completely unread, pristine condition copy of the hardcover of Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being, and that's what she's starting with in January. So I picked it up for like $5 or something, and I will be joining in. So I'll put a link to both of those things in the show notes. I'm excited about both. And before I get into the books, here is the week in review, including what's going on over on my Patreon account. If you didn't know, I have a new Patreon account, and all the details are in the show notes. And here's the week in review that includes some highlights of all that. Possible connection between the magpie and the apple pie, or cherry pie, or name your favorite pie. My favorite pie is Saskatoon berry pie, not just because I'm from Saskatoon, but I like Saskatoon berries, which I don't think they exist much beyond the confines of Saskatchewan or Western Canada, but they may go down into the northern US. You can let me know. Maybe they have a different name down there, but they should all be called Saskatoon berries. They're much, much better than the boring, rather tasteless blueberry. Trust me on that. And they're kind of the color of my blouse. So let's look at the pastry meaning of pie. It entered English in the year 1300.
Well, I have to say before I start that I owe so much of my initial welcome to you. I literally had only done, I think, 2 or 3 videos, and you posted something out on Twitter, and I think you also did maybe on Let's See, but definitely on Twitter, and then all of a sudden I had this avalanche of people. So thank you.
I never did get that check in the mail that you
well, you're getting lost to Tokyo, so maybe I'll have to reroute it. But
I could use it right about now, actually. But anyway, please continue.
So here it's time for book game number 3. For anybody who's new, this is a game where I read paragraphs or short excerpts from 3 different books without telling you the titles or authors of the books. And you, should you wish to play, can leave a comment with your ranking of which of these would be your first pick, second pick, and third pick. And this one sounds fascinating. It has been touted as her most personal, which by which I assume the meaning is autobiographical work. It's got a little bit of supernatural stuff going on, apparently. The protagonists are twins, so it's child narrators. I don't know how long they stay as children throughout the novel, but
They are staying with their grandmother, who their mother doesn't get along with, and there are family secrets buried in the house. Like, I don't know if it means literally buried, but we got a whiff of that they feel that there are spirits in the inanimate objects, and I loved that, the way that was written.
All right. I have finished 2. I have started 3. And I have no bails, so it's going to be a rather short check-in, which is good because I don't have a whole lot of time today to do much editing. So let's get at it. The 2 that I finished were both excellent. They were both 5-star reads. This is the first book I've ever read by Annie Ernaux, Happening, translated from the French by Tanya Leslie. And this was also my debut reading an entire book to one of my top-tier bibliophile bestie patrons, Alina, in Rotterdam, and I read it to her, I had started it the week before, but finished it up yesterday, or this morning, and I see what all the fuss is about. I loved it. It's so understated that you don't realize how she's sneaking up on you with the impact of the way she's telling the story so simply, almost matter-of-factly, but she in the form of very subtle asides, she injects a whole bunch of social political stuff into the story that she's telling very simply about what happened to her. And what happened to her was that in 1963 she got pregnant as a young woman in France by a man that she had no intention of marrying, who wasn't very supportive, and she wanted an abortion, and abortion wasn't legal. And so it's the experience of that, and it's at first reads, like I say, so simply that you think, oh, this is a kind of bland story, but it doesn't stay bland, and bland is not the right word, because the little subtle things that she's putting in, they start to click for you once you get farther in, but she starts that process, she starts planting them from page 1, and what an incredible book. Well, I don't think I have the words, but Alina and I both loved it, and I'm going to read a whole bunch more by Annie Ernaux. I love the way that she would be telling the story, and then almost on every couple pages, she would have present-day observations in parentheses that were her observations of the tricks that memory was playing on her, and also reflections on the process of writing all these years later, an autobiographical, a memoir. She published it when she was 60, and it was the year that she got pregnant and had an abortion. She was 23. It was made into a movie just last year. L'Événement, I don't know how to pronounce that word. It's probably the first thing I've read about a personal experience of having an abortion, and in particular having an abortion, an illicit abortion, and all the dangers that carried with it. And the thing that I took away from it by the end was what she imagined her female abortionist, I'm not going to say too much because you need to read the book, but her somewhat middle-aged, the abortionist worked out of her home, and she was a nurse by day, and the observations that Annie Ernaux had years later about what was in it for the abortionist, who had to be under the thumb of the male doctors all day, and then she was doing abortions at night. There's a whole bunch of gender, social, class, so much about class as well. Just I can't believe how much there was in this little book. Oh, I do have one personal thing, a couple personal things that I mentioned last week. So there's my new chair. You can see. There's my new chair. I haven't quite worked out where to put the tripod to film in it, so I'll figure that out. I do have one extendable bendy one that I could clamp to the bookshelf. So yeah, I'm still working on that, but it's a lovely chair to have here in my library for reading and napping and whatnot. And I got one other bookshelf up in the living room, which is not yet full, so I need more books. I also finished Don Dumont's collection. It's really a novel. It's linked stories. I don't know what the hell it is. It was powerful. Glass Beads, and it came out in 2017. It is her penultimate book, Most of you know what kind of a reader I am and what's important to me and what's not. So filter my enthusiasm for this book accordingly, because I saw some reviews, and I wasn't surprised to see them, that said it was a bit of a mess. It wasn't particularly well organized. There were a lot of gaps, things that were kind of confusing. And I loved all of that, because the characters were so deeply drawn and I got so invested in their lives. And it was 4 Indigenous Saskatchewanians, all of whom were their first person in their family, going back generations, the first in their family to leave the Indian Reserve and to live in Saskatoon. The 2 women were childhood friends on reserve, and then they kind of followed each other to the city. And there was a 3rd one from the same reserve, a young man. And then in the city, they met another Indigenous guy who was political. And then it's the story of the way their 4 lives entwined over the next 20 or more years, 25 years. Talk about a gathering power, because I felt like I knew these characters so well. They were so flawed. Don Dumont didn't give short shrift to any of them. Then to layer the Indigenous experience of racism and the human rights abuses that Canada perpetrates, for which it should be in front of the International Criminal Court. All of that very subtly shown the role of the police. And the main thing that I have to say about this book was that it was heartbreaking to read it knowing what Don Dumont has just recently experienced at the hands of the police, and that is my own subjective opinion of what's happening. Nobody knows what happened, but if it's a choice between an Indigenous woman's version of events and the police's version of events, I know where I stand. And that is threaded through this novel. Indigenous women being victimized by the police. Saskatchewan is really at the top of that tier, or at the bottom of that tier, because about 30 years ago, I forget exactly when it was, cops in Saskatoon in the middle of winter would pick up drunk Indigenous men, I think it was always men, but I don't know that for sure, and would drive them 10 miles out of the city and push them out into the ditch. It was minus 30, and who knows how many of them froze to death. But one time, one Indigenous man was able to get back into the city, and it finally came to light that this has been going on for years, and that is in this story. One of the female characters in the novel is falsely accused of something and goes to prison, and now Dawn Walker, aka Don Dumont, is living it in real time. The book made me even angrier than I usually get, because I know that now she is living the nightmare that is a big part of what she chronicles in this collection of interwoven short stories. I'll be thinking about this one for a long time. So that's what I finished. Really powerful books, just incredible. And I have started 3, and I really have barely started any of them. I was focused on finishing these 2 up, and I had a bunch of other things that were kind of time pressure things, one of which is that I finished editing that thesis and got paid for that dissertation and got paid for it immediately, so I'm not feeling so poor this month, but that took a huge chunk of what would have otherwise been reading time, so I've just got a bare start on these 3. Tara June Winch's short story collection, After the Carnage. She's an amazing writer. I've only read 1.5 of the stories. I guess because I'm tired this morning, I can't think of anything other than cliches, but maybe that's all I ever talk in. I think this is going to be awesome. And I'm just 1 chapter into this memoir that is also kind of a manifesto, Unreconciled Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance by Jesse Wente. I love the first chapter. He's a really good writer. His mom was Indigenous, his father was not, and they grew up kind of relatively, middle class. And then as he grows up, the more that Jesse Wente grows up not really understanding what being Indigenous means in the culture in which he's residing, he's encountering more and more racism. That's how it's starting out, and I think it's very, very well written. I'm 25 pages into this work of nonfiction. We are coming home, and I have to peek at the long subtitle, Repatriation and the Restoration of Blackfoot Cultural Confidence, edited by Gerald Conaty. I have read the prologue that was written by Conaty, who was a Settler Museum curator and I am now reading just a few pages into chapter 1, also written by him, but then pretty much the whole rest of the book is members of the Indigenous peoples, especially the Blackfoot people of Alberta. It's first-person essays that they have written about getting their cultural property back that was stolen by white people 200 or 300 years ago, and put in a museum, because that's what white people do. They steal stuff and then they put it on display. And this is the process of reversing that, and it's starting out really good. All right, so I'm going to start the last 2 books I will start for Skoden 2022, because I've got about 5 days left, and I can probably read them each in about half a day. This work of translated Métis stories of the Road Allowance people, and this is the revised edition, translated and transcribed really from oral tradition by Maria Campbell, and paintings by Sherry Farrell Rosette. And yeah, these are stories that her family and her parents' neighbors used to tell, and she wrote them down, and they're written in very colloquial English, but translated from Michif, the Métis language. Gorgeous illustrations, and there's even actually a CD at the back, but I have nothing to play a CD on. If you've been following along, as Greg would say, you'll know that I read Maria Campbell's incredible memoir, Half-Breed, last year, buddy read with Heidi, and that I had done a little bit of volunteer work that involved a connection to Maria Campbell back in the 1990s when I lived in Saskatoon, but we didn't ever get to know each other. But that I ran into her at the University Library here a couple months ago and had a little conversation with her, and here is the picture, because I have to show it every time I talk about it. So I am going to read this week. As often happens, I will put a book on my TBR and not get to it for a while, or not get to it until, 1 or 2 years later. Lindy will see my video, get it from the library, or somehow get access to it, and read it immediately and beat me to it. Not that I feel competitive. So that's what happened with this one. She has already read it and talked about it on her channel. Inconvenient Skin by Shane Koyczan. Is that how you pronounce it? It is called Inconvenient Skin by Shane L. Koyczan. Yeah, I remembered correctly. Well, here's the thing on the back. Canada 151, which is how old the country was when it was published. 1867, whatever that would have been. Let the degenocide unfold. So it's radically anti-colonial and anti-Canada, which is why I bought it. And there isn't a whole lot of text in it. It was published in 2019, bilingual in Cree and English. So I need to look up this publisher, Thetis Books. And it features art by Kent Muckman, who did the cover image, which is the famous image that every time I show it on my channel, I say this is all you need to know about Canadian history. But there are other artists, Joseph Sanchez, Jim Logan, and Nadia Quandibens. Apparently it was originally written in Cree and then translated. So the translation is by Solomon Ratt. So Thetis Books is a leading North American publisher of Indigenous voices, located on the Silex territory on the Penticton Indian Reserve in British Columbia. First Nations owned and operated. How fabulous. I'd never heard of them. They publish Indigenous adult fiction and children's books. I will put a link to the publisher's website in the show notes. And I can already see half a dozen that I want to get my hot little hands on for next year's Skoden 2023. All right, that's all I got. Thanks for watching.